What lasts longer are two things that are very important. The first is a law code. So I got to kind of make an analogy for this to maybe make some sense. So imagine that you're given an assignment to figure out the law that governs what happens if your dog bites someone else, like your dog bites a neighbor. How is that treated? Is that a civil case? Is that a criminal case? Does it matter whether your dog was on a leash? Does it matter if the dog was being teased by your neighbor, right? You got to find this out. And so you get on your computer ready to, it's going to take a while because you're probably going to have to read a bunch of stuff, go through some forums, something. And the internet's out. So you go to the library and you got to use a card. Well, there's no card catalog. You just got to try and guess what legal book might help. And you can pull down legal books and there's indexes. And you can look up dogs or canines or whatever, and you hope you can find it. Now imagine if you had to do this 50 years ago before there was the internet. So you may go to a library and look for a book, and you may find there may not be that book. So you go to a bigger library. They may not have that book. Go to an even bigger library. Maybe you can find something. But maybe you find two books that give you contradictory answers. So which do you follow? That's kind of what's going on here during this time period. There was no kind of single repository for Roman law. Roman judges would make judgments, and those would be recorded, but they're all over the place. And sometimes the laws contradicted each other. And it wasn't always necessarily clear which one should be followed. Maybe one was an exception, maybe one overruled the other. It wasn't clear. And this had real life ramifications. So there are cases that would drag on for decades because it wasn't clear what the law was. I'm not talking about having a trial and judging things according to the law. I'm talking about they didn't know what law to judge things according to. And when you're in a situation like that, that really favors only the rich. Remember, one point of the law is to protect the weak and the innocent. We've seen that multiple times in this class, like with Hammurabi's code. But when the law is unclear and ambiguous, then basically whoever has the most resources, whoever can hire the most persuasive lawyer, whoever can just delay the trial as long as possible, that person's going to win in the long run. So in order to deal with this legal confusion, Justinian brought together the greatest legal minds of the Byzantine Empire and had them compile a law code. Go through all those contradictory cases, gather all the information they could find, and come up with one code, which then can be distributed throughout the empire so judges and other people could refer to it. Then people would know this is the law, this is how it should be handled. And this is very important because this would become the basis of European law codes later on, and so still impacts European civilization to this day. Another very important kind of development, another innovation in a sense, is the Hagia Sophia. So one thing we have to stress again, this was a Orthodox Christian empire. And there it's interesting here, this is a mosaic. They were famous for mosaics, the Byzantines. This is Justinian offering his government to the Christ child, sitting on Mary's lap. And this is him offering the church. And the church in question is the Hagia Sophia, where this mosaic is located. In Latin, I'm sorry, this isn't Latin, this is Greek. Hagia means holy. Sophia means wisdom. So if you know someone named Sophie or Sophia or something like that, it means wisdom. So it's the church of the holy wisdom, God's wisdom, like the wisdom of Solomon, like that. And I mean, that's a nice mosaic. I think it's impressive. But what really makes this thing impressive is the outside. Right? This thing is huge. It dominates the neighborhood. And this thing was built in the 6th century. And particularly impressive is this dome. Now, it's got scaffolding because they're restoring it in this picture, but this dome is freestanding. There's no column supporting this dome. That is a architectural masterpiece. And I've been inside this building, and it's tremendous, and it's impressive. And you think, wow, they made this, like 1,400 years ago? It's astounding. So this is a massive achievement of Byzantium. Now, you may notice it has these pillars. These were added later. These are minarets. Later, Constantinople will be conquered by the Muslim Turks. They will change the name from Constantinople to Istanbul, and they'll change this church into a mosque, and that's why they add the minarets. And then later it will become a museum. So the key thing here I want to stress is that while in the Western, what was the successors to the Western Roman Empire, they're trying to rebuild civilization. In Byzantium, civilization never fell. And they're pushing it even further. They're developing it. And this is particularly impressive, I think, because the Byzantine Empire had a lot of enemies. Right? It was often attacked by the Huns, also known as the Xiongnu. If you watch Mulan, those are the enemies from Mulan. Persia, of course, was its traditional enemy. And after 632, they had to fight the forces of Islam. And so that's pretty good, facing, I mean, they're constantly being invaded throughout the 7th century till they finally fall in the 15th century, and they managed to hold out. Well, how do they do that? One, again, and I talked a little bit about this earlier, and this is that same map, is the strategic location. It's really hard to finish off the Byzantine Empire because their capital is so important and has such a good strategic location. It's really hard to get at it, to attack it, and it can control the trade in these areas, and it can bring in food if you try and besiege it. I mean, it's just a really, really good strategic location. The walls of Constantinople were famous. You can see they were very, very massive. You had a huge wall here. Then you had a outer wall, not quite as big, but still impressive. And then you had a moat. And these walls would resist sieges for over 1,000 years. What finally brought them down was when the Turks invaded in the 15th century, the Ottomans. They had cannon. It took gunpowder weapons to knock those walls down, but catapults and trebuchet were not sufficient. One other thing, and this just makes my 12-year-old heart so happy, is the Byzantines had what's called Greek fire. And this was first deployed against Muslim invaders. And Greek fire was a flamethrower. So they actually had flamethrowers. And flamethrowers are really complex, right? Because you don't want it to burst into flames while you're carrying it, right? But they managed to figure out a way to shoot something that upon impact, or when it got out of the tube and into the air, would burst into fire. And the Byzantines figured out how to do that. They made these early flamethrowers. But what's also important about the survival of the Byzantine Empire is its very strong identity. Right? Remember, an empire can only last, a civilization can only last as long as people believe in it, as long as they're willing to sacrifice for it, as long as they're willing to identify with it. And in a sense, the soul of the Byzantine Empire, one reason why it still has supporters today, even though it's been gone for over 500 years, is that deep religious identity. So to give you, to kind of illustrate this point, this is St. Mercurius. He was a 3rd century Roman martyr, right? 3rd century Roman martyr. And the story goes, St. Michael, the archangel, the guy who God had kicked Satan out of heaven, gave him a sword. And this is a Byzantine painting in a Byzantine church, kind of reminding them, hey, we've got to fight for this. You know, if we want to preserve our religion, if we want to preserve our civilization, we have to be ready to fight. So it's interesting that they had this following of this soldier saint. And as part of this, they developed their own kind of unique art form that expresses that religious identity, and that is the icon. And that is what you see pictured here. And icons are interesting because they're deceptively simple. Right? Icons are deceptively simple kind of works of art. So like I say, it's flat. I mean, it's much better than anything I could draw, but it's not necessarily that impressive when you first look at it, though I think this one's quite beautiful. This is Our Lady of Perpetual Help, I believe is the name. But it is meant to, in simple terms, express deep theological truths. So when you first look at this, you're drawn to Mary's face, right? You're going to be looking here. But her face kind of, if you follow it, and she's looking out at us, if you follow it, you see Jesus. And studying Jesus, it's very interesting, because if you look, he's looking up here at this angel. And the angel has the cross. And this angel has the spear and the sponge that would be dipped in wine and given to Jesus while he was being crucified. And so he's contemplating his death. He knows he's going to die. Byzantine Christians, of course, like most Christians, believe that Jesus is both human and God. So as having a divine nature, he would certainly know he was going to die, be crucified. But what's interesting too is they also show his human nature, because in the face of his crucifixion, he's clutching his mother's hand. Right? The human nature of Jesus drives him to look for comfort from his mom. So I just think that's a kind of fascinating. But my point here that I'm trying to get at is you have this strong religious identity that suffuses this civilization and is key to one reason why they survive so long, and while they still, in a sense, have successors. Because today, you have a huge Orthodox Christian world. Right? The empire, the Byzantine Empire, might have been destroyed, but the faith that was its soul lives on. Right? These countries here in red are majority Orthodox countries. I think there's about 300 million Orthodox Christians in the world. So that's a lot. Right? These countries that are orange have large minorities. And what's interesting about the Byzantines and their effort to convert their neighbors can be seen in the story of St. Cyril and Methodius, two brothers who were sent out to try and convert Slavic people to Orthodox Christianity. And there's St. Cyril and St. Methodius. And what's interesting about them is they went out to the Slavic peoples to try and convert them to Orthodox Christianity. And the Slavs in this time period did not have their own written language. So what I think is fascinating is that rather than trying to make them learn Greek for religious purposes, and this is important because in Catholicism, the focus was on people should learn Latin, or at least the priest should learn Latin to try as a unifying element of unification. Among the Byzantine missionaries like Cyril, rather than trying to make people learn Greek, they gave them their own alphabet. Cyril and Methodius developed an alphabet for Eastern European peoples to use. The Russian alphabet today is called Cyrillic, after Cyril. So, they converted people to Christianity in its Orthodox form, but they also gave, as part of this conversion, they gave people a written language. And what this meant is that there's a close connection in Eastern European countries such as Russia, Bulgaria, Romania, and so forth, between religion and language. Right? Their written language is developed for the purposes of studying religion. And so as they're developing their high culture, their high civilizations, it's in this religious language. So it's, I think, kind of interesting. So in a sense, you can kind of see the fruits of this high culture that comes from this meeting of Slavic peoples and the Byzantine Empire. This is a very famous cathedral in Moscow. So again, the Byzantine Empire, while in a sense it's gone politically, its religious legacy is still here.